Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬、一鞠躬、再鞠躬、三鞠躬，参加各位点传师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated. Okay, I think time for me to mute my microphone so you can begin whenever you want.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another wonderful Sunday. Derek and I were chatting a minute ago. It's overcast and cold here in Indianapolis, and we're expecting an ice storm around 4 o'clock local time. And it's going to be an interesting day at the grocery store. It's not like we're altogether unfamiliar with that sort of thing, though. It happens every few years here. So, you just take it as it comes. Derek says it's raining out there. That's a rare sight from my experience. But whatever it's doing, wherever you are, it's still a wonderful day to be here and to be involved in the process of sharing and learning to understand the Tao teachings. Today, if I may, I'd like to talk a little bit about energy for life. This is a topic that deals with the essential energies that we all use, with principles from the Tao Te Ching that span everything from the eternal nature of the Tao down to the infinitesimally small quantity of the human being, if you want to talk in terms of scale. And some perhaps interesting little tidbits of information may fall out of this. I read this chapter frequently because it reminds me of a number of traits that it's wise for me to cultivate in my life personally, and probably for most of us, generally speaking. Chapter 42 starts out with Tao produces one, one produces two, two produce three, three produce myriad things. Myriad things backed by yin and embracing yang achieve harmony by integrating their energy. We'll want to keep that in the back of our minds for a moment. Then the chapter kind of branches off to a seemingly unrelated section of lines that say what the people dislike are alone, bereft, and unworthy, but the rulers call themselves with these terms. So with all things appear to take loss but benefit, or receive benefit but lose. What the ancients taught, I will also teach. The violent one cannot have a natural death. I will use this as the principle of all teachings. I mentioned that little passage in my Saturday self-defense class yesterday, and actually got a measure of surprise from a couple of my students, although I refer to this repeatedly. And the reason I refer to this so often is because although we train to protect ourselves effectively and skillfully and with a minimum of effort, the goal, at least in our school of martial training, is to avoid violent conflict at all costs, and conflict in general whenever and however we can. I personally have not been in an unsolicited fight in over 30 years. I don't do tournament fighting anymore or anything like that. Happened for years and years and years and years. And in the last 15 or 20 years anyway, have never found myself in a situation where I found it necessary to use any form of violence against another person. And I think part of cultivating the Tao teachings, and definitely part of any martial training, has to be knowing when to use that training as well as how to use it and when not to. Back to the beginning. Tao produces one. What's the one? The Tao itself we usually refer to as that ultimate source, or the one from which everything flows. But in this particular case, Lao Tzu says that the Tao produces one. In philosophical terms, perhaps we might associate the one with the embryonic universe, or with the universe itself as we know it, as best as we can observe it. But in a more down-to-earth, perhaps pragmatic sense, the one is also the chi, the essential energy of the universe. It flows in and through and around everything. Not everyone is aware of it, but anyone can become aware of it. It simply takes a bit of practice. It says that the one produces two. Pardon. The two are the divisions of chi, if you will, the yin and yang energies. In Tai Chi Chuan training, we separate chi into yin and yang using Tai Chi motion. And this is one of those linguistic instances where I could very easily find myself in trouble, but we'll see if we can't get through it. Tai Chi, as one sees it in the words Tai Chi Chuan, means the supreme or ultimate extent of. Tai Chi Chuan translates into English as the supreme or ultimate extent of the fist. And while most people in America are blissfully unaware that Tai Chi Chuan is a martial science, for those of us who practice it at a deep level, we are intensely aware that it is not just a martial science, but the original martial science, and the most effective martial science that one will find about anywhere. The principles of Tai Chi Chuan permeate every other martial art or martial science practice in existence today, all of them. However, the principle of Tai Chi we're talking about here is not the supreme or ultimate extent of, but rather it is the principle of motion and stillness. It is causing the chi to divide by motion into yin and yang energies, without which most forward progress becomes very limited, and an awful lot of the Tao principles lose basis. It is important to know the distinction between the supreme and ultimate extent of and the movement of either the universe or a person that produces both yin and yang energy and the yin and yang principles. Once the chi is divided into yin and yang, then Lao Tzu says those two produce three. Well, the third thing is somewhat more ethereal, if you will. It is the nature of Tai Chi, the nature of motion and interaction and balance and creation and destruction. It is the interaction between yin and yang. It is that interaction that allows all things to be created, and as far as we can see. And so Lao Tzu says that the three produces the myriad things, the 10,000 things. The interaction of those energies gives rise to everything that we can see and touch. Now, that may not be everything that exists, but it's everything that we can observe. And it is that self-same motion and those self-same essential energies that causes the production of those myriad things at an extremely macrocosmic level, at the level of the universe itself. And so to understand what happens in that very brief creation story is important, because it helps us to understand what occurs within ourselves. There is no living thing on this planet that does not move qi and that does not utilize both the yin and yang energies and the yin and yang principles. Lao Tzu goes on to say that the myriad things, backed by yin and embracing yang, achieve harmony by integrating their energies. Well, what does that mean? Lao Tzu tells us over and over and over again to cling to the yin principle. So when Lao Tzu says here backed by yin, what he's saying is that we are rooted firmly in that yin principle, the mystic feminine energy, what less assertive, more receptive, more passive, more yielding energy than the more assertive and moving yang energy. It doesn't discount the yang principle. We utilize the yang principle, the yang energy. It is that principle that allows us to entertain and then skillfully and appropriately move forward, right? If the yin is passive and yielding and receptive, the yang is more assertive, more moving, less still. But the two are not diametrically opposed. It's not a balance of opposites. It is a true interaction. And so Lao Tzu says that they're able to achieve harmony by integrating the yin and the yang. It is an essential ebb and flow of the universal energies. It is the eternal circulation of qi. What Lao Tzu does not say explicitly here is that when one returns to a state of rest and stillness, yin and yang reunify into the essential energy of qi. There's a gathering place about 2 fingers below the belly button in the human anatomy called the Dan Qian, where the qi of the human person gathers and circulates from. Okay? That same process is mirrored in the universe itself in the ebb and flow and interaction of the essential energies. The other thing that's important to note, and we've all spent, I'm sure, quite enough time looking at the yin and yang symbol as we have it represented these days, to know that there's a little bit of yin in the yang side of the yin and yang, and a little bit of yang in the yin side. They're not completely pure. In all motion, there is always some stillness. And in stillness, there is always some motion. This is a fact that we use to great effect in Tai Chi martial sciences. Okay? If an opponent gives me even a little tiny bit of his energy, I'm able to take that energy and manipulate that person all over. Okay? And it doesn't have to be a large quantity of energy. It doesn't have to be a very forceful movement. All it has to be is a tiny movement from off of center to allow me to control that person to a very deep level. Okay? That same motion and that same stillness exist in both sides of the other essential energies. And so, looking at that, we might infer as well that while there's no real pure yin or yang, the kind of purity we seek sometimes in this life also probably does not exist. For instance, there probably is not a person who is completely pure evil. There's probably not a person who is entirely pure good. Even if we were to compare, say, Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa, known at a very deep level, Adolf Hitler probably loved somebody, and Mother Teresa may have had a sin locked away in her closet somewhere that would be discovered if we knew. And those things being known doesn't make one person or the other better or worse. It simply is the expression of the same universal law, that there is in all yin a little bit of yang, and in all yang just a bit of yin. But as we attempt to achieve harmony, We have to know to cling to that yin principle, to remain flexible, yielding, more passive, less prone to contention and conflict, more tranquil and more at peace, and to utilize the yang very skillfully. It's at this point in chapter 42 that for most folks, myself included, for a fairly protracted period of time, where Lao Tzu branches off and goes down a part of the chapter that just appears to be completely unrelated to anything else he's talking about in chapter 42. And yet these lines appear here, not by accident for sure, and so there's got to be a reason. And it was from that perspective that I started studying this chapter some months ago, and I'm still studying it. I'm not completely sure that I'm right, but I have some ideas. Lao Tzu says what the people dislike are alone, bereft, and unworthy, but the rulers call themselves with these terms. And I've thought on this, and I've meditated on it, and I've studied with it and about it, and read a bunch about it. And while no one single source has come up with exactly what I could agree with between the bunch of them, what I've been able to come up with is that those things are a reminder to the sovereign, us, to remain humble and contrite and moderate and selfless and human with other people around us. Because in failing to do so, we can invite a tremendous amount of trouble on ourselves, and I'll explain why I think that in just a moment. Lao Tzu then goes on to say, so with all things appear to take loss but benefit, or receive benefit but lose. Then he says, I will also, or what the ancients taught, I will also teach, that the violent one cannot have a natural death. And I will use this as the principle of all teachings. Okay. So we have a reminder to remain humble and contrite, to not wantonly get into conflicts of any description. And then we have an admonition against the use of force and manipulation and violence to achieve our own goals or impose our will. And I thought, violence doesn't always have to be a physical attack on somebody. Violence can be as much a state of mind as an action. If we harbor a great deal of anger or hatred towards another person, then we're already in that violent mindset. It's a small step from what we think to what we do. And that bears some caution. Bears a lot of caution and a lot of thought. And here's why I think Lao Tzu went down this path. In talking about the macrocosmic level, the universal level, the very large level, it's important for us to remember that the microcosmic mirrors the macrocosmic. Our lives, at their essence, at their core, mirrors the processes that are at work in the universe. The very same processes that the Tao moves in the universe move within us. And so why would the ancients have taught this lesson? Why would Lao Tzu say that what the ancients taught, that he also would teach? That indicates that this has been around a long time, right? Probably because if it's in any kind of accordance with my own practical experience, that those who truly understand how to integrate yin and yang wield a tremendous amount of power. Okay? And it isn't just martial power. Physical power is the easiest kind of power to learn to generate and use. Even without training. I'm a really strong guy, the training helps me to optimize that strength, but physical force is still physical force. The greatest power there is that once one truly understands how to harmonize yin and yang, one can live pretty much as one wants. And that power can cause the unprepared to succumb to a sense of arrogance, a sense of high-handedness, perhaps a sense of not having to be responsible for that understanding and that knowledge. And I don't think that a person can have one without carrying the other. I think having a great deal of power carries a great deal of responsibility with it. To use that power, be it intellectual or physical or spiritual, to the highest and best good of all concerned. And that if we don't do that, then we can condemn ourselves unintentionally even to suffer the effects of the abuse of tremendous power. And I think Lao Tzu knew that. I think the ancients knew that. And I think the importance of not succumbing to that power cannot be overstated enough. Power all by itself has a way of causing people to become a bit overconfident, a bit cocky, a bit arrogant, a bit imposing, if you will. It provides a great temptation to impose the will of the powerful on the will of those who do not have power. And that sort of activity is clearly not in accordance with the Tao teachings. Okay? So, chapter 42 here isn't just a creation myth. It is a retelling of probably one of the earliest creation myths called the Pangu. But over and above that, it explains the relationships between three of the essential energies, the Qi, the Yin, and the Yang, and provides a foundation for using those energies effectively in every facet of our lives. And I do that day in and day out. You know, I practice every day of my life to skillfully and effectively use those energies, and they help me immensely. But I'm also very aware of the power that those energies have bestowed upon me and the responsibilities for them. So second, you know, those who can successfully integrate yin and yang in harmony have a powerful tool available to them, not just in a martial sense, but in every life situation. But those who fall to the temptation to abuse that power will find themselves at an unfortunate end. And that tends to be true even yet to this day. It's important for us to remain humble and contrite and to maintain a clear head and a clear mind and a clear vision. Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming one of those referred to in the last couple of lines of chapter 42 that say that the violent one cannot have a natural death. There was so much power attached to that sentence that Lao Tzu said that that sentence would be the overriding principle of his teachings. We need to bear that in mind as we prepare to wield the sword of yin and yang. Thank you all very much. It's always a joy to share with you, and I hope this was useful for somebody. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Hey, Bill, could you reiterate for real quickly on the past slide where you said that you weren't quite sure about the interpretation and you've been studying it and the conclusion that you have so far. I just wanted to kind of chime in on that.
What, a couple of slides back?
Right.
Let's see here. Here.
Yes.
What the people dislike.
Yes.
Are alone, bereft, and unworthy, but the rulers call themselves with these terms. And I have. I've read a bunch on this because this particular section of chapter 42 trips me up about 2/3 of the time. It's an abrupt break in a logical flow.
Yes. So over here, at the temple, Chris is nodding in agreement that it's also something that trips him up. The comments that I wanted to chime in on was to point out that the sages have long noted the typical pattern in life that usually as one climbs the social ladder, as one gains social status and climbs higher and higher, the usual pattern is that this person's ego gets bigger and bigger. I think we've all seen that.
Absolutely.
Now, what this chapter is trying to depict is that, because the emperors and kings of ancient China were at the very top of that particular hierarchy, that they're using this as an example to say that the higher up you go, the more humble you must become. So instead of the typical pattern of the ego getting bigger and bigger, you have to become more and more skillful at managing the ego, keep it under control, and always be exhibiting, the humility of the sages.
Thank you.
And for that reason, the king or the emperor at the top of the food chain in ancient China, they have to be the ones to always be the most humble. So that was the ideal of the ancient sages, that at the highest level, you must spiritually be the most humble. Therefore, those are the terms: alone, bereft, unworthy. Out of all those terms that were used 3,000-4,000 years ago, only one has survived, and that's 寡人. So, and that's 寡. Usually, let me back up one step and talk about Chinese. Usually, in modern Chinese, only time you ever say 寡 is when you say 寡妇. 寡妇, 妇 means wife. 寡妇 is a widow. A woman who has lost her husband, perhaps to illness, perhaps to accident, perhaps any number of reasons. 寡妇 is a widow. So 寡人, you take out the wife part and substitute in person. So it basically says, just like the widow is a wife who's bereft of her husband, 寡人 is a person who is bereft of virtue. That is, someone who feels like he or she still has a lot to learn about the Tao and virtue. So 寡人means literally this bereft person. It will be used in a similar place. If you hear some of the speeches or the statements that's made by the Queen, and here I'm talking about the Queen of England. In modern times we still have a Queen. She will use the magisterial we. When she wants to say, I feel that the acts of violence in Paris is to be condemned, she will say we instead of I. In ancient China, instead of we, the ruler will say 寡人. Every time that ruler wants to say I, 寡人 is used instead. So the typical person would say 我, me, myself, and I. 我觉得, I feel. Whereas the king would say 寡人觉得, this bereft person feels. Like addressing, using the third person to address himself, to refer to himself. So I know it's a different cultural thing. This is the sort of thing that people never really hear about, so I wanted to sort of add value to this meeting by bringing it up.
Truly appreciated, because that was a tough one to get through.
Chris, was that helpful? Okay, I get a thumbs up from Chris. So that's excellent. Great discussion there.